Hey, this is John. Thanks for joining me for this video today. In this video, I'm going to continue the build of Jerry. Now, as you may recall from the previous exciting episode of this series, I got everything painted, decaled, gloss coated, and panel lined with just a very light panel line wash. So all of that is done and prepared, and I'm ready for the weathering. Now, my plan as of right now, and I know this can change over the course of any video depending on how long things are taking me and how much I ramble on about various things. My plan is to get all of the weathering done in this video, get it finished up. I'm hoping I can get that in, but if it starts getting too long, I'll go ahead and find a nice stopping point, wrap that up, and then we'll move on to another episode to get that wrapped up, because I know sometimes if I start pushing these things up to close to an hour, it can be a little bit to sit through. So I want to try and be more cognizant of that. Now, the order in which I want to do things, I want to start off with some chipping, and that in this build, even though I want this to be a very weathered and dirty model, I want to try and restrain myself on the chipping a little bit, because sometimes I think I rely a little too much on chipping for weathering and not enough on other effects. So I'm going to start off with the chipping, but I'm going to go in with a fairly light amount, and then only later, if I think that it still needs a little more, then I'll go in and I'll add in some additional chipping. But first step, chipping. So let me get everything together for doing that, and we'll proceed from there. All right, for the chipping, I'm going to use this Vallejo Mecha Color chipping brown. I did add a drop. It's probably about 5 drops of this, 1 drop of this. I did add this black gray into it because I'm liking a little more desaturated look to this brown color. I really like it, but the more I look at it over time, the more I use it, the more I think that sometimes it can be sometimes confused with some mud. So I wanted to make some distinction there. I'm just going to use my old sponge here, and you know this drill. You've seen enough people do this in a video that you know what's going on here. But I'm going to add the chipping heavier around the feet for, I think, obvious reasons. I mean, that's where it's stomping around on the ground. That's what's going to receive the most damage. So I know I just talked about not going very heavy, but down here I think it makes sense to go fairly heavy, simply because of the amount of wear and tear that you would suspect that this kind of thing would go through, regardless of the terrain it's in, whether it's an urban environment or you know, a more wooded area or a desert area. At least that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. but I think a heavier level of of chipping here will be warranted, and then I'm going to just dial it back as I go further up. Now, I will go in later and add some rust tones. I was just watching one of Lincoln Wright's videos. He was working on a, what's it called, the White Knight that he's doing in his Patreon videos, and he mentioned somewhere in that video that in Canon these are not made of ferrous material, meaning they would not rust. But rust looks just so darn interesting that I'm gonna go ahead and take some liberties with it and do some rusting, just because I think it just adds to the character of the model and the notion of what's going on. And you know, as always, your goal, my goal, hopefully your goal in building models is to have fun. And if something, you know, that you like doing brings about more fun in the hobby, then go ahead and do it. You know, don't worry if people say, well, that's not how it's supposed to be. This is a make-believe thing. I think sometimes people forget that. You can see I finished this up in that amount of time it took me to ramble, and I didn't go real heavy up here on the main part of the leg. I did go heavier down here on the toe. I'm really liking that slight change of color, adding it a little, making it a little more grayish. I'm thinking I may mix up a bottle or try to find a bottle of something like that. I like that a whole lot better. I think it still looks like chipping, and it still is going to be a good basis for rust. But sorry if that was out of focus. I just realized that. It really, in my mind, looks the part. So I'm quite happy with that. On the upper hull, I'm going to be a little more selective also. What I'm trying to think about is what are areas that are going to get knocked about a bit. Like I would imagine this area around his hose nose, as that moves around, that might get some chipping, you know, as it's articulating and doing the things it does. Plus those edges seems like they would get some chips. A few might go here, but remember this guy's not going to be moving like an airplane at, you know, hundreds of miles an hour. So any chipping is going to come from either the crew moving around on it or it moving through the environment. So like here, I'm thinking that the legs might, as it's getting moved, you know, as it's moving around, those might get knocked about a bit. So there's going to be some chipping there. And again, I'm trying to keep a fairly light touch with this. Even though I'm touching it in a lot of places, I'm not actually leaving that many chips. There's a few, but not a lot. But then, like, I would think this area here is going to get some because that's where people are going to be doing things. I'm not sure which side I would imagine the pilot would climb up on, because I'm assuming these are things that you don't step on, though I may be wrong. But I'll just to keep in the genre, because so much of it is based on World War II aircraft, from Ko Yokoyama's, you know, he's the inventor of it. So, and he liked World War II aircraft. So I'm going to think, hey, they came up on the left side, which is where most World War II pilots came from. So I'm going to put a few more here, especially on like this handle here. Do that on the other side. Although I guess there's more handles on the other side. Who knows? I'll do a little bit on both. But I'll just put some around here. I'm going to put some around the hatch, because that definitely would be an area that it seems like there would be more stepping about on that as it moves around. And so I want to put a few there. Now I'm going to go back here in a minute and I'm going to do some additional brush chipping. So I'm going to get those in also, because that way I'll be able to reach areas that I can't reach with this sponge. And I just had the most horrible thought. I thought, am I filming? And I looked over the camera and I was. So anyway, I've done that before. I'll be just sitting here rambling along doing something, and I'll look up and the camera will still be sitting on the same timestamp, and I'm like, oh, I didn't turn it on. And so I have to go back and, you know, figure out some way to redo it. A lot of times, if you ever see me do like one small part of a model and say, well, here's how I'm going to chip the rest of the model, it's because I forgot to film the main part of it. I forgot to turn the camera on, and so I have to kind of make up for it. Anyway, I'm just going to continue this, and I'll get back with the brush chipping and hopefully remember to turn the camera on. Okay, I want to do a little brush chipping now. Oh, and one thing to note, I changed my mind. The pilot's coming in and out this side, so I chipped it much heavier over there where he would climb in and out. I also took the hatch off so that I could chip the edges separate from each other. I still haven't decided if I'm going to glue this thing shut or if I'm going to glue it open, but I figure in either case they'll need separate chipping patterns. So I've got everything chipped like I want. It's a very light, like I said, it's a very light touch, and it's even better when it's on camera. I kept it very minimal to try and, like I said, just keep it restrained, except for that one area. I had to go crazy there. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do some brush chipping because I want to add some streaks in and get to some areas that I couldn't necessarily get to with the sponge. So I'll be doing both spots and streaks. Now for this, I like using this Wargamer detail brush. It's a pointy brush, but it's got enough of a belly to hold some paint. They've got one called an insane detail brush, which is like, it's insanely small. And it works really well, but it just doesn't hold enough paint. And this has such a nice tip that I think it does equally well. Now, what I did was I added into, so it would flow a little better, I added into my paint a drop of airbrush thinner and a drop of this Liquitex Flow Aid. I had first heard Vince Venturella talk about this. I thought that Flow Aid and stuff like Vallejo's Flow Improver were the same things, but he was explaining they're not. That this truly does make paint flow better. So I believe him, I trust him. So I got some of it, started trying it out with painting, and you know, I really tried some areas with and without it. It really does make a difference in how the paint flows off of your brush and onto the model. You have to just use a very small amount of it, but it's some great stuff. But what I'm going to do, and again, you've seen this, but I'm just going to get a little bit of paint on my brush. And I'm going to go in and I'm just going to find areas that I think there needs to be just a bit of a streak. Now, when I'm doing these, sometimes I'll be deliberate and say, okay, I want, like right here, let's put one that's a solid line. You know, maybe that's a streak that, who knows, a tree hit it, or you know, a piece of rebar from some concrete that scraped through there. Other times I'll do this and I'll do, in my mind, I don't know that I've ever verbally stated this, but in my mind I think of this as a dance streak where I just kind of move the brush along and it develops, and by using the dancing of the brush along the surface, you develop that pattern like that, which again, it's a streak, but it's got some variation to it. And then, of course, in other places, I'll just go in and maybe I want to just get a dot chip somewhere. And so I'll just put in a dot. I mean, literally a dot. And you can line up a few dots. You can have a group of dots that can, you know, indicate something falling against it or hitting along the side or whatever. Like that, so you can develop that how you want. But I just go around and I do those in areas that I think would get scraped up. Like I'm going to put more on the front here because I'm assuming there's going to be more scrapes. Fewer on the back because whatever it's scraping through, I'm going to assume has been pushed out of the way. Although there will be, if you've ever been in the military and you busted brush, you know the guy up front, while he's walking through all the limbs, the guy in the back, if he ain't paying attention, he's going to get slapped with them. So I could see how there could be something that this would scrape by as it's walking by. It could scrape and push it this way and get a lot of scraping, and then it flips back. So there might be some scraping back here. So I'll try and reflect that. One other little note to make, just something I do when I'm working with a small brush like this, even if you're using a wet palette. I'll occasionally, I put some of the airbrush thinner over here. I'll just occasionally come over here and clean the brush off because the paint will dry on it really fast. So occasionally cleaning your brush while you're doing this, and I do it, you know, I probably do it every 5 or 6 chips. I don't let a lot of time go if I can remember. Sometimes I forget, but I don't let a lot of time go. So that's something to keep in mind as you're doing it. So let me continue working on this, add a few chips in on these decals, and then we'll go on to the next steps. One thing I wanted to show was a method for chipping decals. Now, it's a high-risk technique, and I say that because I'm going to use my hobby knife. So you have to be careful with this. But what you do is you just basically go in and lightly scrape the decal. Now, I'm going through a layer of gloss, the decal, paint, and then down to the primer. So I may get different colors there, but the idea is you can chip away parts of the decals and get real realistic looking chips because they are chips. Now, I'd already done some paint chips, but I started to do this and I thought I probably ought to show this. But you just scrape away as much as you want, and I'm not putting any pressure on it. Sometimes I will sit here and develop a chip for probably far too long that I could just paint it on. But I think it gives it an extra dimension of realism. Now, if you do chip further than you mean to, meaning down to, even if you go down to the plastic, just put some paint over it. It's going to have a little bit of texture to it, which is actually going to make it look more realistic. But chipping your decals is, in my opinion, a very good idea because they're paint just like everything else, and they're going to get some kind of chipping, especially these little stencils, because a lot of times those are, I remember doing it on my own vehicles in the Army, those are sprayed on later. Like if you touch up some paint, you may have to spray something back on, and you just slap a stencil down over it. And we used to just use Krylon paint on our Humvees, so they're maybe not as durable. So adding some chipping there is really going to help in terms of the realism. You can, and I've done this before, sometimes I'll just do nothing but paint chips, but more and more I'm liking the idea of using a hobby knife or even a file to just file that back and really get some cool chips that look cool because they're really chips. One other quick note when it comes to physical chipping. If you look at some of the larger decals, and you may have to turn around in the light a little bit, but if you see an area where there's a bubble underneath the decal, you can slip your knife in there and chip that bubble away. And it leaves what, in my opinion, is a really cool chip. That white you're seeing there, what I'm thinking that is they must have undercoated these decals with white to get a good saturation of color. And I like that little remnant of white that's around that. So anyway, I just wanted to show that because I thought that was really cool, because I did a similar kind of thing over here, and I thought, hey, that's worth showing. Okay, the next thing I want to do is I want to do some dot filtering on Jerry here, and I've got my colors lined up on my palette. Now, the question about your palette is not how well is it set up. The question is, what fun did you have getting there? Today, blueberry waffles. So always make sure when you're getting cardboard palette, or palette cardboard, or cardboard for your palette, whichever it is, always make sure you eat something tasty to get it. You know, it shouldn't be like cat, I mean, you don't eat cat litter, but it shouldn't be cat litter or, you know, an Amazon box. It needs to be something tasty. Anyway, the colors I've got here, I feel like Bob Ross here calling off my colors. Actually, he ran them along the bottom of the screen, didn't he? No, and he called them off too. All right, anyway, titanium white, yellow ochre, phthalo blue. This is light red, sap green, starship filth, and raw umber. And you can tell the ones that I've just broken open because they've got the most oils coming out of them. I got lucky. There's a craft store here in town that went out of business a few months ago, and they had their Winsor & Newton, the big tubes, the big ones, on sale for like $2 each. So I went in and just bought a load of them. I'll probably never use half of them, but that kind of price, why not? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a piece of tape and I'm going to stick it down here so that I can prevent my palette from sliding around like that. And then I've got some odorless thinner in my metal palette here, and I've got 3 wells full of it because quite honestly you can never have enough odorless thinner hanging around. And then all I'm going to do is I'm going to apply dots of these with a toothpick. I want the streaking to be fairly fine. Sometimes I'll break out a bigger brush and put much larger dots, but this time I want it to be a little tighter. Not that I don't want it to show, but I think in this scale it makes more sense to have smaller streaks than larger streaks because you're zeroing in on much more detail. So I'll just put these on here, and quite often I'll do multiple applications of the dot filtering. I'll put some on there and then I'll see how I like it, and then I may go back and start putting in just individual streaks. I'll actually thin the oils down and just streak them with a brush. I won't do it the traditional dot filtering way, but rather just take a brush and just draw in various ones just randomly. And by having thinned paint to do that, I'll end up with additional streaks. Now I could do that from the beginning, I suppose, but it takes a little while. Now this blue, I'm going to have to watch this blue because I have heard Bob Ross say that phthalo blue is a very powerful color, and so I don't want too much of this, because I know I've heard him say it's one of those ones that when he's mixing it, he'll say, "Now only use a little bit of this because it'll take over your whole world." So I'll start light with that and see where it goes. But there's not necessarily a pattern to the dot filtering. You can use, more lighter colors on areas that are going to receive more light and darker colors on areas that are going to receive more shadows. And there's certainly some merit to that because it helps develop the contrasts and the lights and the shadows and so forth. I'm not doing that here. I'm just placing them around without a whole lot of thinking. And if you're watching this and you've done dot filtering, you may be thinking, yeah, I can see you're not thinking very much, which is okay, I guess. Sometimes I think that's the fun of modeling, is just kind of letting yourself get lost in the moment, which I feel like I'm at right now. So I'm really enjoying this process. And when you enjoy the process, I think you do better work and you have more fun. And quite honestly, I would rather have more fun. I want to do good work, obviously, but if I'm having fun and something's not necessarily looking like people might expect it to, I'm okay with that if I'm having fun with it. I'm not going to go crazy. But anyway, there's my dots. Now it's time to grab some brushes. All right, for the actual streaking, I'm just going to use this well-worn flat brush. This is one that I use it for a lot of things, but its primary job is doing this streaking here. Now there's several ways you can do this. You can start off with it dry and begin streaking it that way. You can damp your brush down, get most of the terpenoid off of it, and start that way. That makes it move another way. You can even wet the surface first, then put your dots down and then streak it. Because this is over a gloss surface, I'm going to start with it dry, because it's real easy on a gloss surface to just completely wipe away all of the oils. So yeah, I could have satin coated it, but I'm not a big fan of putting loads and loads of clear coats on a model. So I'm just going to start streaking it. Now, I like to do it slow. I find that if I start streaking very quickly, it tends to muddy the colors up a bit. If you start using a motion that's like this, and maybe it's different for you, but I find that when I do that, the lines of the colors start getting blurred, and what I end up with is just kind of a gray blob, kind of a gray mess. It doesn't impart individual streaks. It ends up being a patchy filter, which is not what I'm wanting. So I like doing this slow. You'll note that I'm not brushing it off, because as it picks up those dots of color, some of those dots will stay on here, and I add additional streaks along the way. Now that I've got it started, and it's at this stage, now's when I'll take my brush and dip it in that odorless thinner, and off camera, I didn't have enough room to get everything on camera, so you're gonna have to trust me that I'm damping it off. And I keep touching it to the paper towel. That's what I'm doing this whole time that I'm yammering on. I keep touching it to the paper towel until I don't see any more of the thinner coming off. There's still some in there, but that's just going to smooth the application a bit. And I'll do this more and more, but I just keep streaking. And by streaking, I mean the oil paint's not me. Ever since I was a kid and Ray Stevens, was that his name? Released that song, The Streak. Every time when we're talking and modeling about streaking, every time I hear that, I kind of chuckle and think of Ray Stevens and that silly song. Don't look, Ethel! It's too late. She done been mooned. Or however it went. If you hadn't guessed, this is early in the morning. I'm kind of tired still. I may be feeling a little silly, but hopefully y'all are okay with that. All right, but I'm just going to continue this process. And it really is just something you just keep doing until you almost wipe away all of the streaks. You want to leave, it truly is a dot filter. It's a dot, and you bring it down, and it creates a filtered effect in a single streak. And then there's multiple colors of little filters all across it. So you just keep doing it until that is achieved. And some colors, some sections are going to do it better than others. Some of them you may have to go back multiple times and get that color on and wipe that color down. So I'm just going to keep doing this, and I'll show you what that looks like when I'm done. All right, I have that all streaked out, and you can see most of it has disappeared. Once the terpenoid dries and it gets that kind of wet look off of it, more of the effect will show. But I wanted it to be a real light effect. I didn't want it to be too heavy. I may go back in, like I said, and add some additional streaks. But I wanted to note a couple of things that I did. In some areas, I left more of the streak because it made sense to me. Like right here, just after that piece of armor, I left that streak. I didn't fully blend that in because I thought, okay, that looks like a good streak there. Same way with right here. There's a streak that I just like how that looks. There's a rust colored one right here. So as you're blending these in, you can blend them in fully if you want, but in some areas, if a streak produces an effect that you want to leave and it goes from being a dot filter to an actual streak, just leave it there. Now, when it comes to the underside, all I did was, you'll get to a point if you're pulling it down like this, that when you flip it over, there'll be, like right here, you see that tide mark of color? All you do is just keep drawing that around to the bottom until it basically disappears. And in that way, you won't have this tide mark of stuff right along there, along the bottom edge. Now, for the rest of it, the front, I'll put the hatch back on temporarily, and I'll streak this down this way. I'll do these sides the same way. The very top, I'm going to do more of a stippling motion to blend everything in, because the flatter surfaces, I think, look better with it blended in. Now, you do have to have some kind of transition between the flat surface and here, so at some point you've got to start pulling it down. But again, oils have such great working time that you can do that without a problem. It'll look good. And on the bottom, I'll just do some stippling. The bottom I'm going to leave, I'm not going to worry as much about, because this is going to be an area that has more dirt and dust effects than actual streaks and filters and things like that. So I'll get to work on doing that, and just show you the progress as I go. Sometimes when you're doing dot filtering, you can get a little more color on decals than you want to. What you do there is you just continue filtering over it, and then you just go back in with a brush that's got some thinner on it, and you just kind of clean that up. You reactivate the oils, wipe it off on a paper towel, and just keep going back and forth cleaning that up until you get as much of the oil off as you want, so that your decal is not quite so faded or worn or whatever. You can certainly leave it that way, but you can do a little, if you want it to be a little brighter, just clean it up a little bit, and it's real easy to do. On the underside, I did some very heavy stippling, concentrating on the darker colors. I left off the white and the ochre, and mostly went with the red and the Starship Filt and the raw umber, because that's where there's going to be dirt and rust and all sorts of things. And I put it on there. You should have seen this just 5 minutes ago. It was a muddy mess, but that was deliberate. I kept stippling with a big fat brush, wiping it off, stippling some more, wiping it off, developing things where they wanted, It seemed to, the red color seemed to come out right here, so I left that because I thought that works. It just gives it a really worn look on the underside, because I figure this is where, there's going to be, and I'm going to do more effects obviously later, but there's going to be mud getting thrown up on this. It's going to collect dust. It's, everything that runs down from the top is going to end up here. So I was really happy with how this underside turned out. And I finished this thing's hard to handle. There's no real good place to put a holder. On the engine deck, I did the stippling with the darker colors also, because that needs to be grimy. On the upper part, I did stippling with lighter colors, and then of course the streaking down the side like I did on the other one. So this part is finished. Now for the legs, I'm going to treat them a little different. Because of all the greeblies and details and things like that, it can end up being a muddy mess if you start trying to put a lot of dot filters there and streak them down, because you're running into all those greeblies. You've got all sorts of different angles. And remember, this leg is going to move, so there's not going to necessarily be, unless it's just, sitting at a museum somewhere, it's not going to necessarily be all the same vector. It's not going to be all the same direction, because as the leg moves, there's going to be things that run down it. There's going to be streaking, but it's going to be varied. At the same time, there's going to be some stippling. You could do it with stippling, but then you don't have the streaking. But if you do all streaking, you miss out some with the stippling. So what I like to do in this case is I get some odorless thinner on a smaller brush like this, and I go into my oils, and I just kind of get on the brush just a little bit of, I guess you'd almost call it a wash. And I just start adding that in as streaks like that. And I don't worry too much if all the angles aren't the same, because like I said, you're going to have things that streak different times depending on, you know, maybe it gets back from a mission and it's standing in one position and that develops streaks in one direction, and then it comes back from another mission and maybe it's standing in another way. You know, the pilot leaves it with the legs pointing another direction, and it gives it just a slightly different angle. So by going in and just adding these in and switching to different colors, you're just building up layers of these streaks. And notice that, you know, in some areas, if I get them a little heavy, I just go back in with oil or with thinner and I blend them out. I don't know that there's a right or wrong answer here. It's just adding layers of color and streaking it on there. And you can concentrate some under, you know, you may want to put some of the darker stuff under the bolt detail and then go in with thinner and hit it like that. But you just keep working this around until it gets to, as I've mentioned before, that TLAR standard. That looks about right. So that it looks like it's part of the upper hull, which has its own type of streaking on it. Also, because it can take over very quickly, I tend to do the lighter colors in very, very sparing amounts, if at all, and just focus on these streaks, because this is going to be where you could also imagine there's going to be a lot more grease staining and things like that. So this is not only trying to replicate, you know, dot filtering, but it's also beginning that process of grease stains and the other things that are going to collect on these lower legs. On the top of the feet, I'll just do the stippling like I did on the engine deck and the top of the hull. But just streak some colors on, and you'll get a good look with it that fits in with the rest of the model. All right, you can see on the leg there the different streaks and things that I developed, and some of them I went for darker colors and you know, begin the process of adding in the grease stains and the fluid stains, and there's some reds in there just a little bit that kind of start hinting at rust, which will also be developed later. So it's just a process of streaking those paints on like I showed until you get it to a point that you like it. You can go heavier, you can go lighter. If you see a place that you missed or that needs to be developed more, you can always go back and add to it. Oils are very good for this because they're very forgiving. I can go back and make adjustments even a few days later, and you know, remove some of it if I need to. Now I've still got to do the other side and the other leg. I've only done this one side as I've worked on this. And also you can see I stippled in the top of the foot and just gave it some different coloring. I'll let that dry, and I may go back and do some adjustments on that to add just a few lighter tones. It's heavier on the darker tones, and I mean, I'm okay with that, but I may go back in and add some lighter ones to this just to you know, it's not going to be in shadow as much as maybe the rest of the leg. Look at that, got a little streak right there, and I'll just pop that down. And so anyway, I may make adjustments to it, but I'm pretty happy with how that is looking, because I think it'll go with the rest of the model. Okay, well, I know I've only done a few steps in this video, and normally I like to try to put in more, but we've had, I guess you'd say, the opportunity to go out to visit some family in Texas. That comes a little sooner than we had planned. We had hoped to go out there later in the summer, but circumstances have meant that we need to go out there a little sooner. We're going to visit my wife's parents, who are octogenarians. They're in their 80s, and they just need a little help with getting some medical things taken care of. Nothing severe, but just some home health care things that they need, and they just need us there to help them. So we're going out a little early, and of course it'll give me a chance to see my grandson, so nobody had to twist my arm to go do that. But it does mean that in you know, you won't know this on camera because all of this just kind of happens in one continuous sequence. But over the last 2 weeks, when I've known we've got to go, I've actually had to put together about 6 videos in the space that I normally do a couple. So I've been scrambling to get that done. So I think for this part of the Jerry build, this is a logical stopping point because I need to let these oils dry before I can go in and do more stuff. So setting this aside, I won't be back until near the end of June, and so it'll give these plenty of time to dry, and I can come in later and start doing the rest of the effects. I hope I'm going to be able to get in the final part of finishing the weathering on this in one more episode. But, you know, I really want it to be heavily weathered. I really want it to look good. So, you know, if it's one more episode, 2 more episodes, there's no fixed timeline that has to happen. You know, I'm really trying to get it to that standard that it just looks about right to me. So we'll see where it goes. Well, thank you so much for being a patron. You don't know how much it helps to be able to do this work at the pace that I do with the materials. And I say this all the time at the end of every video, but I mean it. To do the work that I do at the pace that I do with the materials I do, to have the freedom to do this. It's not my full-time job. I do have a full-time day job, but this is my second job. This is another 40 hours a week for me, and I love doing it. And I'm able to do it because of you guys that support me. And I appreciate all the patrons, but I especially appreciate you guys that are at the $5 and $10 level, because I know that's no small commitment. You know, some of you may be thinking, it's no big deal, but I know there's a few of you, I know it is a big deal, and I really appreciate that. It means so much to me. And I feel like what I give in return is completely inadequate for the commitment you've made to me. So I hope you enjoy this. Forgive me if it's not, you know, if it's not reciprocal in terms of, I just don't feel like that I can ever give you back what you're giving to me. But I will try, and I hope you get some enjoyment out of this. I hope you like these. And don't forget, you know, I know most of you guys that are at this level, you're all excellent modelers yourself. So I say this with a bit of hesitation, and I don't mean it to sound like I know everything that could come up in modeling. But if I can ever be of service to you guys, I try to help everybody, but trust me, if you guys ever need help with anything, let me know. From a modeling standpoint, or I mean, you know, if you just want to talk, I will go out of my way to try and help you. Whether it's how does a product work, or have you ever tried this, or hey, you know, I want to know if this works. Can you test it? I mean, if I can, I'll test it. I'll be your crash dummy if that helps you. Whatever I can do to reciprocate for the commitment you guys have made to me, and I just really appreciate it. And I know this is probably stretching it out a bit long, but I want you to know I really am grateful for everything you guys are doing for me. All right, with all the sentimental stuff out of the way, I'll go ahead and close like I normally do, and I mean it every time. In this hobby, if you're not having fun, you're doing it wrong. Happy day to you, friends. Bye-bye.